Welcome to the Growth Over Grades podcast, a show connecting you with thought leaders, pioneers, and change agents who are leading the charge to support schools and districts in making the shift toward competency-based education and to promote growth over grades. I'm Jordan Lewis, and on the show today, we have educational leaders and co-authors, Jonathan Vander Els and Brian Stack. Jonathan is a former principal of a nationally recognized model PLC and competency-based environment. He's now a director of collaborative learning for the New Hampshire Learning Initiative, a partner with V&S School Solutions, and an associate for Solution Tree. His experience both as a practitioner and consultant allows him to blend expertise with real-world application, to meet educators where they are and assist them in developing practical next steps to ensure high levels of learning for students. Brian is the superintendent for Fremont School District in Fremont, New Hampshire, transitioning from being a principal of a school that is a member of a nationally recognized K-12 competency-based learning system. He's an educator, author, and associate with Solution Tree, gaining more than 2 decades of experience as a high school teacher, curriculum director, and now administrator. He's also worked as a consultant and expert coach for schools and organizations across the country, focusing on personalized and competency-based learning. Together, Jonathan and Brian have co-authored several books, including Breaking with Tradition, The Shift to Competency-Based Learning in PLCs at Work, and Unpacking Competency-Based Classrooms, Equitable, Individualized Learning in a PLC at Work. Their most recent book, co-authored with Dr. Karen Hess, is Elevating Competency-Based Learning, Actionable Assessment, Defensible Evidence, and Equitable Grading. Today, we dive deep into the 7 principles of competency-based learning systems and discuss how school districts can effectively lead change to implementing, but also demystifying the common misconceptions people may have around a CBE model. We discuss why a focus on actionable assessment is key and how to develop systems that support all learners. Now to my conversation with Brian Stack and Jonathan Vander Els. Brian, John, welcome to the show. First and foremost, thank you for the time. Thank you for joining us. Your expertise is going to be well warranted on today's conversation, because today's conversation is going to be talking about some pretty big systematic shifts that we're going to be seeing in our education system over the next little while. But also, I'm excited about it because I know there are a lot of leaders who are eager to bring apart these transformations, but are looking for ways and strategies to start and to build momentum and to continue the momentum when we're thinking about a systemic change. So it's definitely the perfect conversation for us to be having right now. So both of you, welcome to the show.
Thanks so much, Jordan. We're happy to be here.
Okay, John, we're going to kick it off here with you. And to start, I think it's probably in the best interest of our listeners if we just define competency-based education so that way they get a good foundation. And as we kind of go through with the definition of what competency-based education is, I also want us to think about what is competency-based education often mistaken for?
Oh, excellent. Great place to start, Jordan. Brian and I are super excited to be here with you. This is something that's near and dear to our hearts, so to speak, and something we've been involved with for quite some time now as practitioners, and also supporting schools that are trying to make that transition to a competency-based system and really ultimately trying to meet the needs of each and every student in their school. We really work off of the Aurora Institute's 7 design principles for competency-based learning. It certainly served us and many others well in helping to try to provide some guardrails. And so I think the best thing to do would just be to go through those 7 design principles, and I'll kind of kick us off with the first one, and then Brian layer in with the second, and we can go back and forth. But the 7 design principles are really helpful because part of your question was really around what it's mistaken for, and oftentimes people, and I think we were somewhat guilty of this ourselves when we first started out down this road, but folks think that it's just about the grading itself, and grading is this component of a much larger system of learning that occurs. And if you start with the grading piece, typically going to run into some problems there. So that'll be part of the second design principle that we talk about. But again, there are 7, and that grading piece is only part of design principle 2. We really like to look at things more through the lens of assessment in a competency-based system rather than just the grading assessment for and as learning. So, but design principle one, just to kind of kick us off in that sense, is really, we hear the term student agency a lot in education, and design principle one kind of takes that, and it's much more than that. So it's really about empowering students on a day-to-day basis in the decision-making processes in their school around what their learning experiences will entail, how they can create, apply knowledge, and then ultimately how they can demonstrate their learning. And so when we think about agency, sometimes it just is limited to like voice and choice. But when you hear, that component of a designed, of a competency-based system and learning experiences that are designed with students in mind in all aspects of it, it just kind of changes that. It changes the viewpoint of what school could look like. And a traditional system really doesn't do that. So that's where we start. We start with kids, which, we love. I think the field recognizes that we have to put students first in the learning experiences that they're having. And the definition is no different. It starts with students.
The second, Jordan, thanks for having us. We're thrilled to be here. I needed to say that. The second design principle gets into assessment. And of course, in a traditional sense, we think about assessment. We often use the word test, right? Mm-hmm. We have to learn something so that we can take a test. But when you think about assessment in a competency-based system, it's supposed to be, or it's designed to be, a meaningful, positive, empowering learning experience for students that gives timely, relevant, and actionable evidence, right? So when you think about that much more detailed definition, the word test doesn't really fit. Right? So what John and I, what we often talk about is the collection of a body of evidence of learning. And anytime you collect evidence of learning, whether it's diagnostic, formative, summative, whatever it's going to be, it needs to trigger some sort of a response for the learner and all of those who are assisting in that learning process, the adults in the room. So that's the second principle.
Right.
Thanks, Brian. And then from the assessment, like we would say, the collection of evidence, right? From that meaningful, balanced collection of evidence that's happening on an ongoing basis in classrooms, teachers and students need to be able to respond in a timely, unique way for kids based upon what they need. So design principle 3 is really around that. There's got to be a system in place that's really guaranteed, right? So when a student needs support, they're going to get it. But that system responds to students in a timely, targeted, flexible, fluid way, meaning that when we know that a student needs to practice a skill more, they have the opportunity to do that. If we know that a student has already mastered a skill, and this is a key piece of CBL that will come up in the next design principle as well, they have the opportunity to go deeper and extend their learning. So it really is based upon the evidence that's collected and responding to it, and then trying to help students who are struggling, which is design principle 3.
Design principle 4, we used to call it the move when ready principle. So when competency ed started long time ago, a couple decades ago, that phrase move when ready was very prevalent in schools around the country that were thinking about how can we move away from seat time and have learning be a measure of the degree to which you've learned something, regardless of how long it takes, right? So that's that notion of that design principle. It's that student progress is based on evidence of mastery, not seat time.
Thanks, Brian. And it leads into design principle 5, which is kind of has a couple components, and really it's about students having the opportunity to learn by doing. So learning actively through different types of experiences, things like ELOs, extended learning opportunities, externships, internships, things like that allow students to actually practice skills in settings that are real world. So that's part of it. But then also the pacing piece. We recognize in a competency-based system that students learn at a different pace than each other. So, if the three of us were going to learn a brand new skill together at the same time, we probably wouldn't all master that skill at the same time. Right. But that's how schools are set up. Typically, traditionally, unit by unit, we learn, we test, we move on to the next one, but kids aren't always there. So the pacing piece is a unique part of a competency-based system, and also just allowing students opportunities to, learn by gaining experiences that may not be part of a typical school day. I think about my daughter who did this in high school, and, my wife and I encouraged her to try different things. And I have a sister who is a jeweler, and she thought that maybe she wanted to be a jeweler. And she did an internship with my sister. What she learned was very valuable. She loved making jewelry, but she did not want to do it for a job, right? She wanted to make sure that she did that just out of love of doing it. But that's a valuable experience. And sometimes, kids and learners don't get to do that because we're kind of locked into a system that maybe doesn't allow for that to happen.
Right.
So the sixth design principle gets into this notion of equity. And this is a word that gets used a lot and overused and misused a lot in our field, right? So I want you to think about equity in terms of not just providing opportunities for equity, but rather ensuring equity. And there's a big difference between providing opportunities and ensuring, right? And that's where competency ed really goes deep. You want to ensure all students can be successful. And that insurance, that equity assurance, has to permeate in the culture, structure, and pedagogy, the actual day-to-day work of the schools, because all really does mean all. It doesn't mean most. It doesn't mean we're setting it up for all, but, then we have this one over here that has this and that. No, you've got to dig a little deeper.
Right.
And you've got to think system-wide of how you can ensure for all students.
And then the last design principle, 7, is really around balancing academic content knowledge with these other, skills and dispositions. And so, like, oftentimes we'll be working with a crew in a school, like a team in a school or the school itself, and we'll just ask, what are the things that your students need to know and be able to do graduating high school to be successful in a college or career? And, oftentimes most of the responses are really non-academic skills, things like communication, collaboration, self-direction, critical thinking, innovative thinking, problem solving, right? And so in a competency-based system, and this is something that really Brian and I believe really strongly in kind of to encouraging within the schools, you're balancing, you're holding both to a high regard, so to speak. So academic content knowledge, very important. And these other non-academic competencies are also critically important. And if we don't focus on both, then we're not setting kids up to be successful when they graduate. And so, balancing that out, and then really importantly, not mixing it together in a grade, right? So that we can have a true idea of where students are in both the academics and the non-academic components is critically important. So we try to make those as visible as possible. Right. They need to be explicit and transparent, but then also actionable in the sense that how do we allow students to be able to practice these skills and transfer them so that it all kind of comes together.
And hearing you both talk through these 7 design principles, I feel like we just created a micro series of growth over grades where we're going to have to dive deep into each one of these 7 principles and expose a bunch of things. We won't have time for it today, but to our listeners, put it in the comments if you want to hear the 3 of us break those down. Because I was getting really excited just hearing about the key components of each one of those principles and how fundamental they are as a system to bring about better holistic approach for students. But as you were kind of talking, Brian, I was curious if you have any thoughts on what system leaders might mistaken competency-based education for. Like, are there any misconceptions about a model that you hear often?
Yeah. Well, it goes by different names in different places. So you have to look past the name and really look for those 7 design principles and their existence, right? You don't need all 7 principles to be practicing the work of CBE, but you will need them at some point in your journey to deepen the work. But, standards-based learning, proficiency-based, mastery-based, evidence-based learning. Those are phrases that we hear. Different states, depending on their state policies, may be thinking competency ed, but they're using it through the phrase student-centered learning, right? So you can't judge a book by its cover, so to speak. You have to look under the hood at what does that actually look like. So in those 7 design principles, you start looking to tease out, are there some clear measurable expectations that are broad competency statements with enduring understanding? Is assessment being used in a way to help move students forward and help them identify where they're struggling and engage them? Are there opportunities for students to move when ready? You really have to start thinking about and peeling back some of those design principles in order to get to that. But to John's point, originally, we go a lot of places, and the first thing people will say, especially at the secondary level, is, oh yeah, competency-based learning. That's when we grade differently. And what's funny is, did you notice that grading wasn't really listed at all in any of those 7 design principles? Now, it certainly comes out as a byproduct when you're talking about assessment, because you've got to score student work and you've got to report on student work. And we want to be calibrated in our approach to grading practices. And we want to make sure those practices really do promote and ensure learning, so that we can say that there's a 1-to-1 correlation between grades and the degree to which a student has learned something.
Right.
But that isn't the lead off there.
Right. And just to summarize those sort of 7 principles that we discussed before we start thinking about putting it into practice, we talked a lot about, student agency, but taking it a step further to empower the students to demonstrate the what, how of their learning, which is a critical step leading to assessment. And Brian, I love that call out that we're talking about meaningful and empowering assessment, not just grading that test. And I feel like people can get so stuck on that, but reporting and measuring should be ongoing, not just a moment in time. And the moment in time is something that I get so hung up on, because you can even remember back when you were in school, you have a bad day, you don't sleep well, you miss breakfast, and then you go into that test and you're not your best self. But why is that representative of where you're at in your learning? It's not at all. And That can change in the next hour, in the next day, in the next week. And I think, as a design principle, thinking bigger picture about assessment is critical. And we are also responding in the timely fashion. I love that. The need for actionable feedback. The days of red ink on a page 4 weeks after that measurement or test or opportunity took place is not meaningful at all. And we need to, as a system, think about how we can support students with where they're at in the moment to actually allow them to move forward. The move when ready principle, I also love. Kudos to states like Washington, which are changing their policy around the seat time model to showcase progress as mastery of outcomes. Like, the fact that their state legislation put that policy through is such a massive step forward to these systems. And I think that is something that school systems will need to consider of, how do you know when a student has shown mastery? Like, what is the best vehicle for them to actually demonstrate that so they can move on when they're ready? It is a great principle. Opportunity to learn by doing, the hands-on learning component is I think something all educators strive to do and get hung up on actually accomplishing it. Ensuring equity, that every student in your system can learn and will learn in an equitable fashion. Ending off with the balance. And Jonathan, that balance is something that we're hearing so often of, how do we balance certain skills and competencies against the academics? And seems to be this consistent fight between school teams who are building the culture around the balance community who is valuing the academics more? How do you have it? And how do we infuse them together so they're not siloed as two separate things in the system, right?
And Jordan, can I give an example that kind of ties all of this together? Because I think a lot of times for leaders, you want to find some good real world examples when you're working with parents and students, community members, maybe school boards, even teachers, to help them understand this at a deeper level. Sometimes you've got to think of a non-academic example to really drive home the point, right? So here's a good one. I have 5 kids. My middle child right now is starting to practice driving with me. He's 15 and a half. He's in that zone. He is motivated to get his license when he turns 16. One of the competencies that we have to work on is parking a car legally and safely in a variety of settings, right? That's an apply and transfer skill, because you don't know what kind of car he'll be driving, what the parameters are for the spot he'll be trying to get into, all those other things, right? He's got to be able to apply and transfer that skill. He hasn't started driver's ed yet, but I can already tell we're going to be spending a lot of time on it. And I can say that because the 2 kids before that I've already worked with, one got it right away, one did not, right? Kids move when ready, right? And you have to be able to take that skill and break it down. Now, what's interesting is Liam could tell you right now what proficiency looks like in parking a car. Doesn't mean he can do it, but he knows exactly what the finished product should look like to be proficient. And everybody in our state is going to have to demonstrate that skill at that proficient level before they can get their license. Anyone can do it. I would argue sometimes some people pass through the system or they forget after they get that license, depending on when you see the way some of them park, right? But as I'm working with Liam, I've got to be able to unpack that skill so that I can help him figure out how to be successful at each part leading up to that moment where he can apply and transfer those different discrete skills that go into that process of parking a car legally and safely in a variety of settings. So that's the kind of logic that we use when we're working with teachers, because a competency statement is very similar to that, right? It's a broad overarching skill where we want students to apply and transfer their learning in some way. We have to be able to break it down. We need to be able to provide kids feedback so that we can do intervention and extension with them along the way, help them reflect on where they're at, move when ready, do it in different ways, right? And ultimately help them be successful or proficient with that skill.
Right. Such a good non-academic story. Like every person who just listened to that can immediately see themselves or their children going through that process and connect it. So I appreciate you sharing that story, because when you share it in that way, it doesn't seem like it is as difficult as I feel people are making it feel. Right. And Jonathan, I'm curious to start going down this path for leaders who are aiming to start making this shift. Like, what are some of these crucial first steps that they can do to start transitioning to a CBE model? Now, we know it's multi-year. We know it doesn't happen overnight, but what are some of these first steps in the phase?
So this is an area that I think I can speak for Brian when I say we've become so much more intentional about in our work supporting schools, because change is difficult. We know that, right? And we also recognize that we believe there's an intrinsic desire in educators to do everything they can to help kids be successful. And so you want to try to tap into that. So typically what we do and where we encourage leaders is to be very clear about where they're trying to go. So we use kind of this model. It's, stems from professional learning communities of focusing on the mission, vision, values, and goals, and being clear about that. But it can't be just one person or a few people. And so I think it's one of the things that we did pretty successfully and I'll speak for our school, is that we built what we call a guiding coalition, developed a guiding coalition, a group of teacher leaders and administrators learning together, trying to set the pathway for where we were headed together. And through that process, we were building the collective capacity to be able to support the change at a level that was going to be fruitful in allowing our school to get better at where it was. So the mission answers the question of why we exist. Clarity on that's important. Now, I would say I don't know of too many schools that don't have mission statements, right? But what happens is a mission statement is developed and it gets put on the wall, so to speak. If you know what I mean, like it's words
Right.
on a wall. It's not something that is really truly lived. And the vision, mission and vision, obviously working hand in hand. The vision answers a question of what's the school that we need to become. Conversations around that with a staff is critically important as well, because it's really recognizing that we're not quite where we need to be yet. And where do we want to be? And so then you start to backwards map that, right? These are the things that we need to do in our school. And so as it relates to competency-based learning, there's got to be clarity around the role of teachers, administrators, so educators in the system, and the environment they create. Okay, and so I think that this is the piece that we really try to stress, is that if you look at the sixth design principle, which Brian shared with us, but it's about ensuring equity. That's a strong word. Okay, when we start to think that way, there has to be a belief system that's in place that we believe that all students can learn at high levels. And it comes down to that. And when we talk to staff sometimes, and even our own staff, somebody might say, if you ask, do we believe that all students can learn at high levels? Somebody may respond with a yeah, but, right? And it's, well, they don't get any support at home, or they're, all these different variables that, quite honestly, we can't use as excuses. The kids are in our school. We're going to do everything we can to help them. And CBL is really about helping kids find the pathway that is going to be the one that they want to go down, because it's a passion. It's something they want to explore further. They want to use their skill sets to make an impact in the world in some way. And so our job as educators is to try to help them navigate that. And so these processes, the mission, vision, gets into the values pieces. So the collective commitments. School change is really difficult, as we said earlier, but it's really about what are we going to accept? Because that culture piece is about what's going to build the collective efficacy, which we know, that shared belief that a group of teachers, a group of staff at a school can positively impact student learning, has the greatest impact on learning. So getting people the momentum moving forward and making sure we have the teacher leaders, the right teacher leaders, the ones who are honest, respected, and trustworthy, to be the ones to help influence that work is critically important. So being able to envision where you want to go is key. And then getting the people that need to be a part of that process engaged, and then having difficult conversations about what that looks like. And then very, very importantly, including students in that process, because we try to change schools, but oftentimes we don't ask kids, like, what is it that works for you or not? And they have to be part of that. And so when you think about, competency-based systems, it is about growth. It is about finding where kids are being successful, leaning into strengths. If you think about design principle 1, it's really about empowering kids. And that's a change in the system, right? Traditionally, it's been a very adult-oriented system. And we're trying to flip that on its head in CBL and make it a very much student-centered system.
And Brian, as we're thinking about these shifts, imagine I am a district leader. I've spent the last calendar year working with my staff. We got student voice teacher voice. We've refined our mission. We have our vision. We know what is going to be sort of accepted and the growth that we want to really lean into. What are some initial challenges that I might encounter as we actually begin to put that mission and vision into practice?
Well, I think one of the first ones that may come up is how are you realizing your mission and your vision, right? Is it something that's happening because you pushed it out to folks and asked them to put a poster on the wall or put a statement at the bottom of their email? Like, that's probably not enough. You have to get to how is the mission, the vision, the values, and the goals, how are those changing the decisions or impacting the decisions that are being made at all different levels in the system, not just by you, but by all. So that means that folks have to have some ownership and some buy-in and a level of commitment towards those beliefs. They're not just taking them as, oh, somebody else gave us these. They made these because we needed this for somebody else. You want those things to truly drive individuals' work, students and adults in that system. So I think that one of the challenges leaders face initially is they try to do too many things too quickly on their own, and they forget that step about the intentionality that comes out of reaching commitment with folks instead of just having compliance from them. One of the best things that a leader can do is establish a guiding coalition to help lead this work in their school. Not a leadership team, right? This is, again, taken right from the professional learning community work, right? So a leadership team might be a representation of folks from the school professionals in the community that help a principal or make recommendations to a principal or a district leader so they can take action on something. A guiding coalition accepts responsibility for ensuring the work collaboratively. And there is a big difference there. There's a level of buy-in that exists when you have guiding coalition members that see themselves as part of that collective responsibility for ensuring that those beliefs really, really take root in everything that happens in the school. So that's probably where I would start.
John, I'm curious if there's anything from your perspective to expand or dive deeper on there.
There's one thing I would add in. We've both talked about guiding coalitions, in the last 5 minutes and the critical importance of that. The one thing I would add there is that a guiding coalition is different as well, in the sense that oftentimes in school change, we tend to focus on the technical aspects of change, this what we call the skill pieces, right? Those are the things that are clean, right? You can check a box on them. We built a new schedule. We put a new curriculum in place. What we don't spend enough time on are the will aspects, right? The adaptive change pieces, the culture, climate, mindsets. Guiding coalitions balance those two very important aspects of change. You can't do one and not the other, and it goes both ways. But guiding coalitions have to attend to both. And so for leaders that are engaged in the system, we would just caution, and we do, that they have to attend to that culture, that will piece, which is murky, right? It's not as clean cut. And so, in change processes, we tend to focus on the things that we can check a box on because it feels better. Where what we've seen, when you focus on some of these more murky aspects of the change process, that's what's going to give you the bang for the buck. That's why things like collective commitments, actually talking about the values that we have as a staff together, and then trying to set boundaries as far as the behaviors that we're going to all agree to really try our very hardest to put in action on a day-to-day basis. Right. That's different. And I just thought of one more thing I would add. Brian talked about what leaders need to be aware of. I think one of the most difficult things in leadership and we've both faced this, in leadership positions. But when you've had these conversations and the staff has decided upon certain things, and then like the norms or the collective commitments are violated, there has to be a response to that, right? And so I think what I've found, and just to share like this, something that I've recognized is like most educators really they get frustrated by the resistors, right? That are resisting irrationally because they want to do the work, but we tend to spend more time on a few people rather than kind of moving the work forward over the majority. And so leaders have to be willing to hold the line, so to speak. Right. When things that we've talked about are important to us have been violated, then there has to be some sort of a response. And sometimes it's just a reminder, like that, this is, we said we didn't want to do that, right? We wanted to try to do this instead. I found that just honest, transparent conversations go a long way, and with staff, and that's how we approached it. And boy, did it get better over time, but it was very hard to do at the beginning. I will say that it's absolutely the truth.
And it makes me think, because when we were chatting a bit off camera, we talked a lot about, as we're leading this change, there's a lot of inspiration that we're trying to do to build that culture around the staff to have that commonality, to have that buy-in. But there's also this idea of sustaining the movement, because we don't want it to lead to complacency. We don't want it to just taper off and be the trend that we're going to start with. And we want to ensure long-term sustainability of the movement, even long after that initial excitement might fade. So Brian, when we're leading this change, like, what are some steps that a system leader can take to sustain that momentum even after that coalition has gone in and started doing some of this work?
Yeah. It's a great question, Jordan, right? Because that's, I think, one of the problems that educators will point to all over the place. When something isn't working in a school, they'll say it was poorly implemented, quickly implemented, or, the program of the year or the flavor of the week, right? And then they'll point to change in administration. They'll come up with a lot of reasons why things don't work or didn't work or won't work. I think for a leader to do this and do this well, first of all, they got to recognize that this movement has to be able to exist and grow independent of any one person in the system. So even that leader that may be initiating that work, they have to recognize that this isn't going to flourish if others can't take the lead and really start to own some of this. I think another important thing here is leaders have to be able to communicate that this is a long game and not a short game.
Right.
This is not something that's going to happen in a year's time. It's not something that's going to happen by checking some boxes and working through a punch list of things and getting to the end, right? This is transforming the way that you think about schools and the way that you respond as a system to learning and helping kids be successful. So as with any new system that you're going to look to implement, you may already have some places where you're doing some good work that would line up very well with a competency-based approach and provide you some good on-ramps to help you build some momentum for the work. You're also going to have to recognize there are things that you're just not ready to touch yet, right? Like if you were listening to the design principles, there's probably a lot of high schools that are saying, we can't touch Move When Ready right now. We're a credit-based, Carnegie-based system. We have to award credits based on seat time and how many hours you're tied to a class. We're not ready for that. Doesn't mean we can't get there, but that's not where we're going to do some of our deepest work right now. So what John and I always try to do when we're coaching leaders is to think about this as a 3 to 5 year plan and to think about the work in phases, right? So your first phase of the work, your first year or two, may be about developing those belief systems and maybe really digging into those design principles around student expectations so that you can be insanely clear about what it is you want your students to know and be able to do. that's going to help you graduate into a second phase of the work where you can really start thinking about how you build a defensible body of evidence of learning for the things that you've identified that are going to be are essential, things that you want students to know and be able to do. And then it's going to allow you to move into a third phase where you really think about how you're using that evidence that you've collected to respond in different ways and have a system of responses for kids, like a multi-tiered system of supports, right? So if you break it down that way, I think anytime we've worked with a school, they can kind of layer in and say, here are the things we're doing really well. Here are the things that we know we need to work on. And you can start to map that out as a plan. But I will say this, whatever you come up with for a plan, have a way, a measurement tool that you can use to chart your progress year over year. This is super important, right? Like in John and my first and second book, we included a school design rubric that really takes those 7 design principles and shows what it might look like to be doing those at the very early stages of the work or the more sustaining stages of the work. Imagine using that tool as a self-reflection tool and conducting a self-reflection as a system every year so that you can show where you're making gains in which design principles so that it helps you determine where to plant your flag this year for some of that deeper work. And it helps everyone in the system understand this isn't about checking boxes. This is about transforming our belief system and the way we do business here.
Brian, I'm so happy that you and appreciate the 3 phases, because I feel like a lot of leaders get incredibly excited about the outcome of this transformation, and they do want to just approach the design principles and say, we're going to implement all 7 of these right away. And it does become overwhelming. But I love the call out of looking at where you are as a building or a system today and go, what are we going to dig into and what are we not ready to dig into, and start there. I think it's just such an easy, I shouldn't say easy because there is a lot of moving pieces, but it's such a good, logical way to actually start the work. And that I feel like is another big barrier is you may approach the 7 design principles and go, okay, we're going to work through these, but where do we even start? Right. And knowing that this is not an overnight shift, I think is such an important distinction and an important call out to make. So I'm appreciative of that breakdown. Now, John, when we start thinking about this shift, change management is also a part of this from a leadership perspective. Talk to us a little bit about some key strategies that leaders can take to help with effective change management as they start to phase or move through these phases.
Yeah, and I think reiterating some of the kind of structures and components that we've talked about already is key. Part of the initial question was sustaining the movement, right? The reality in schools is that people leave. And if leaders leave, you want to make sure that the work is able to move forward. The way to do that is to, again, build capacity. And so through change management, you want to lean into the structures that are in place in your school, things like a guiding coalition where you're constantly reflecting. You're constantly in a process of saying like, okay, where are we now? What Brian just defined, right, is a way to get people to start. You can't wait for everything to be perfect because it never will be. And so people have to start somewhere. And what we encourage folks to do is really do that self-assessment and think about where is a leverage, like what's an area that we actually, like we could lean into, like we could use to get us going, right? But then that constant cycle of reflection allows people to kind of course correct along the way. What tends to happen is we get into a school year and quite honestly, it's hard, right? So you get into a school year, all of a sudden it's January. That list that people had, like we want to try to do this year, all of a sudden it feels pretty daunting at that point. And you're in March and then all of a sudden the year is over. and it's almost defeating. So small wins are important to kind of keep that momentum going. And in the change management part, always seeking out feedback. Like we haven't used this word actually, which is a key word in a competency-based system for both students and for adults, but that feedback loop, right? Actually, that level of self-awareness is critically important. So leaders have to attend to that and be willing to address the areas that are needed so that you can move forward. And we have to keep in mind, like, this is about kids. And if it's uncomfortable for adults, then people need to be willing to embrace that. Because when they do, they'll end up in a better place if the environment is such that people can, be that transparent. So, that reflection piece is key. Communication is, it seems almost repetitive, but we have to be able to communicate effectively with each other to understand where we are, and not just to get feedback one way, but we have to actually seek out certain things, and it may be the things we don't want to hear. The 7 design principles, to me, what we found is that, like, if you come in through assessment and you're trying to develop your assessment techniques to get better information so you can support kids to a higher level, it just automatically leads to these next steps. All right, we have the evidence, but what do we do with it? Well, that's going to lead to design principle 3. Well, we have to figure out a system that we have in our school to meet the needs of each student. Oh, but we're not, meeting kids who are already proficient. Well, we have to now use extensions, right? It really does feed itself. And I can say, me personally, I've never worked in a school or a district that all 7 design principles are at, like, the highest level. There's always work to do. And I think that's part of the mindset to sustain this as well, is that it's an ongoing process, right? When we're thinking about our schools and our educators working collaboratively, Brian and I like to think of it through a PLC lens, that there's a level of collective inquiry and action research that's happening. And it's all the time. It's a cycle of that. It all goes back to support kids. So teams are wondering about things together. That's the collective inquiry part. Like, what if we did this? Or what if we allowed this group of students to try this, right? Or kids are coming to you, right, and saying, we want to show our learning this way. The action research is, well, what worked well? What didn't, right? And people sometimes fear that because it seems punitive, but that's how we learn. Right. So it's just a constant process of iteration, quite honestly. But it takes people being willing to set time aside for that in a situation where time is such a precious commodity.
Right. And I feel some of the best successes that I've heard are when system leaders can help create time. And I've seen a bunch of different examples, but one that I'll share here is there was a school system starting to reimagine kind of their assessment protocols, and they wanted to have a documentation process where students are going to show their mastery in the process and reflect on it and speak toward it. And they said, okay, for the teachers that are going to do that, instead of doing 3 traditional report cards a year, you're going to do 2 student-led conferences and 1 report card a year. So they flipped the script, created the space for the teachers to not have to spend those, 100 hours writing report cards, so they could reflect, iterate, and create those experiences and opportunities for the student. And it was really successful because they took away and allowed that space to happen.
Yeah. It's about rethinking, like, what could be. And I think we get stuck in a box sometimes. And I think one of the key things about CBL is we're trying to encourage students to be problem solvers and think outside the box. As adults, we have to model that sometimes, right? I'm going to give you a quick example. Schedule-wise, schedules are a bear. They really are. We were all together in a room, and I asked the question, as a principal of the school, I asked, how is our schedule created? Like, what do we work around? And so we were able to identify, and this isn't unique to our school, but lunches, right? Bus schedules, and then band and recess. And so the band piece had to do when the band teacher could be there, right? So that was a tough one. But so somebody asked a question, well, why are our lunches at that time? And what do you think the answer was?
I know.
What was it, Brian?
Because it's the way it's always been, John.
That's right. So I literally got up from the table. I said, let me go ask the cafe service director, right? And so I went down and asked her that. And she said exactly what Brian just said, because they've always been that way. I said, do we have any leeway? Because we need 10 minutes here. Like before the lunches start, we need 10 minutes. And she said, well, I think so. Like nobody ever asked. So once we were able to kind of manipulate some of these, there were barriers to instruction, by the way, right? To actually, in a school doing what we needed to do, collaborating, those types of things that we know are so important. We were able to kind of move forward.
Right. And John, I heard you talking a bit about, throughout that, again, coming back to the mindset, right? Like the mindset of the teachers and the leaders to sustain these movements. And I know that in one of your latest books, you talk a lot about fundamental structures and mindsets that need to be put in place for these models to thrive. Brian, can you talk to us a little bit about kind of what some of these fundamental structures are?
In order for the work to thrive, sure. I mean, as an educator in the system, you've got to think differently about how you use assessment, right? You've got to think differently about your role as a facilitator of learning and not a deliverer of content, because the kids can get content anywhere,
right?
From these little devices to everywhere, right? So it's about helping kids apply and transfer their learning, which means they have to work through that process of learning a new skill and developing that skill to whatever that level of proficiency is going to be. And if you have a heart-to-heart with yourself as an educator and realize I'm no longer responsible for just delivering the content, but I have to help kids get to that level of proficiency where they can apply and transfer, it transforms how you approach planning, how you approach instruction in your classroom, how you approach intervention. You quickly decide that it's not easy to do alone. So there's another mindset around recognizing that I'm not the expert in everything and it's okay. Mm-hmm. I'm going to collaborate with my peers because together we're going to be able to do far better things than any one of us could trying to operate in a vacuum or a silo, right? So that's got to be another important piece. And I think you've got to have a willingness to be a change agent. That's a big one. And I'm talking about a change agent at every level in the system. So yes, leaders, you got to be change agents to push the envelope and move the work forward, but you got to be a change agent in your own classroom. You got to do things differently than maybe you did last year or let alone last decade, right? Those are some really, really important things in this work.
I just love the idea of like pushing the needle forward and the call out of not staying stagnant. I feel as a former teacher, one of the scariest moments was when, you finally get through that year and then you do go into that moment of self-reflection on what did or didn't work. And you have that ugly dialogue with yourself because you never want to admit that things didn't work the way that they wanted to. But I feel like talking with what John was mentioning a bit ago, like as adults, we need to model this to our students. So let's actually like go through the exercise and come out on the other end with better strategies because we're doing this to help kids. And if we're not willing to admit that to ourselves, when we're not going to get very far in supporting kids right now. I hear a lot about misconceptions around grading practices or measurements and assessments. People saying things like, oh, a competency-based model isn't as rigorous as what we're doing right now, and our kids are going to get off easy if we make these shifts. John, let's squash it. Just a few of these misconceptions right now about this model.
Yeah, I chuckled when you said that, Jordan, because anybody who is, conceptually, I think that's just something that just gets passed along that just isn't true. So competency by definition, is the ability to transfer in and across subject areas. Okay. So that's from, some of the earlier days, Rose Colby, that kind of defined it that way. But that's always struck us because you can memorize facts, right? And this is what happened. I mean, I think anybody, I'll talk about myself. There are times where I just studied for a test before the test. I would do okay on the test, but if you asked me that same material 2 weeks later, I didn't know it, right? It's lost. That's not transfer. True learning has to be represented by the ability to replicate learning over time and in different scenarios. And that's what a competency-based system really allows to happen. And so it is more rigorous. There's a higher level of complexity. Performance assessments, which are a kind of a key part of a competency-based system, we believe, because they're by definition, they require a student to actually apply their learning in meaningful ways. And so as educators in a competency-based system, we want to see that the student can take the skill and then apply it. And that's just different than what traditional schooling might look like. So there is absolutely a higher degree of complexity. When we're grading or assessing, we want to make sure that we have enough evidence to make a confident determination about where a student is. And, we've had teachers say to us that they put a grade on a piece of paper. This is a kind of a non-competency-based system. They put a grade on a piece of paper and they're just hoping parents don't ask about it because they don't have the backup, right? That's not a great place to be. Understanding where your kids are and what they need next is what we're talking about. And for students to be able to say, I'm not there yet, and here's what I'm doing about it. Well, that's an incredibly wonderful, healthy a way to look at learning. That I'm going to get there. I'm not there yet, right? So I have to keep moving. But some things get in the way, and it's traditional structures of grading, like, the gatekeeper kind of mentality, like I get to decide whether you move forward, right? Even if the student has demonstrated the evidence. You're going to earn points in my class by doing different things that may not have anything to do with actually your understanding of the content. And that's just unfair, right? So we want to know what kids have learned. We want there to be an incredibly high level of rigor with that. And we want to be able to say to our students, and for students to say to us, I like that, approaching it that way, for a student to say, I am prepared. I know that I can go out into the world and be successful. And we want to make sure that that level of complexity is there. So when they face the issues that we know they're going to, the World Economic Forum in 2020 had a research study that, from employers and colleges about the skills that students need. The one statistic that always jumps out to me, and this was back in 20, so a few years back now at this point, but at that time, primary age students, so kids grades K to 2, they were thinking that about 60+% of them would be in jobs that don't exist today, right? So when they get out into the workforce, they're going to need to be problem solvers, right? They're going to need to think critically. So that's what competency-based learning does.
Sure does. Jordan, your question made me think of a model that Ken O'Connor, my friend from Toronto, uses a lot when he's working with leaders, and they have to defend this notion of an evidence-based or a competency-based system with grading. And when it comes to the grading piece, Ken makes it really simple. He says, I want you to take a look at the grades that you're giving in your school Can you say that they're consistent, accurate, meaningful, and supportive of learning? Because if the grades don't have those four things, you've got broken grades in your system that need to be looked at. And I can tell you right now, we have a lot of broken grades in our system around the country. I'm thinking about my own high school students as they're talking with all their friends at the end of this school year, thinking about, and they go to a very traditional high school, traditional grading, every teacher grades a little differently, and they're talking about class rank and the kids that made it into the top 10. You know where I'm going with this, right? Because on your podcast, you talk about this all the time. But two kids arguing over why one should have a higher rank than the other when they arguably took an easier class or had a class with what they argue is an easier grader, right? Or somebody that focuses on different things. Well, what it boils down to there is that you've got a system that lacks either consistency, accuracy, making grades meaningful for kids, or making them supportive of learning. And that's the true measure. So forget about getting caught in the weeds with, we need to figure out exactly how many points this will be or that'll be, or what's our reassessment policy going to look like when it comes to this little micro example. Like, start with those four big buckets and let that drive where you go in developing a grading system that's going to work for your students.
It just makes me think, Brian, hearing that story about those students, like, where is their motivation tied to? And, when I was in my last year of teaching, I had one student who I often talk about when I'm working with schools, who on paper, academically, he was failing in almost all subjects across the board. But when I built a relationship with that student and I got to know them, I realized, the student, they're smart. They are learning. They're showing key competencies, like they're can communicate, they can collaborate, but they're just not represented in my gradebook based on whatever arbitrary measurements I've chosen to give to that student at that point in time. And that has always stuck with me as an educator, because I thought to myself so often, his experience around school is simply motivated by the grade that I'm giving him. He doesn't see learning as something that he wants to do. It's something that he just has to do. And that story, with what you just mentioned, kind of resonated heavily, where we need to shift that so students are excited about those opportunities to learn. And what John was mentioning earlier, the pathway to help them find that pathway forward. And I think with all the modern technologies, we're needing to be pivoting and evolving in our system so much quicker because of the technology. Like you mentioned, you have a mobile device that is able to access everything in real time. Now, I know a lot of schools are banning cell phones, whatever side of the fence you sit on that could be for another episode. But, real life is open book. Why are we having students memorize facts to regurgitate on a test? To me, right. It's just something that I'm excited about when we think about these shifts. And as we kind of wrap up our conversation today, I want to hear both of your answers to this question. But why do you believe that competency-based education is the future of our K-12 system? And John, we can start off with you.
Sounds great, Jordan. Well, I think traditional systems have been in place for centuries at this point. And the world has changed drastically and continues to change drastically. And so I also know that students today, and my wife and I have 3 kids of our own, range in age from 13 to 20, and have been through elementary, middle, and high school, but they're learning differently, right? And they want to be able to take what they've learned and apply it and know why they're learning. And a competency-based system provides kind of the structure, so the guardrails to allow students to get the support that they need, seek the pathways that are of interest to them and learn through that process, be in environments that value them as human beings, right? And as learners, and recognize their unique skill, have high expectations for learning, but then also there's enough autonomy in there especially when we focus on the learner to allow that level of engagement that we're really truly seeking in schools, and that today, more so than ever, is so critically important. And I would add, on the adult side, there's nothing like being part of something that's bigger than yourself and being in a system, in a school that is wholly dedicated and focused on meeting the needs of kids and trying to do that collaboratively. It's incredibly empowering. And I think that that's why we got into education as educators, and CBL is the very best way that I've seen that be able to happen.
Jordan, thanks for letting John go first, because that's everything I would say. So I won't repeat it. I won't repeat it because I agree with everything that he said, but I will add this. The world is competency-based. Why would we not want our schools to be the same? We expect our pilots to know how to get us up and down safely. We expect our doctors to be able to help us when we're sick and care for us and perform those surgeries. We expect all of us, when we take our driving test, to park a car legally and safely in a variety of settings. If I hire a plumber, I want him to know how to fix the problem that we're having. The world is about applying and transferring in new situations. We need our kids doing that as early as we can. That's what a competency-based system is designed to do.
Today, John, Brian, we're talking about breaking the system. We're talking about helping students find a pathway that's right for them and applying it to the modern world. To both of you, thank you so much for joining us on the show. Thank you for your insights and expertise here today.
Thank you, Jordan.
Thanks, Jordan. Pleasure to be here.
That was education leaders and co-authors Brian Stack and Jonathan Vander Els. Hey, thanks for listening to the show, and please make sure to hit the follow button on your podcast app so you never miss an episode. I'm Jordan Lewis, and you've been listening to the Growth Over Grades podcast.